It's the Under the Ring Report. Now, here are the masters of armchair booking, John the Flesh Wound and Cousin Tom.
And welcome, folks, back to another edition of the Under the Ring Report. John the Flesh Wound here, along with my trusty sidekick, Cousin Tom. How you doing today?
I'm great. I'm styling and profiling.
Woo! Well, that's what we're going to talk about. First of all, I did run a poll earlier today on Twitter, and 90% of people loved the 30 for 30 Nature Boy. So everybody, I mean, Twitter was blowing up during the show. Everybody is kind of falling in love with the way they portrayed the Nature Boy in this ESPN documentary. It's a good thing for wrestling, and it's a good thing for the Nature Boy.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, especially after the health scare, you could say, what they say, 20% chance of living, something like that. It was something ridiculous, and he somehow managed to pull through. It was a great thing, and I heard no negatives at all last night on Twitter, social media. I mean, everything I read or saw was all positive.
Yeah, and that's the same with me. I mean, there was a lot of people thanking the director, giving props to the Nature Boy, and it just seemed like a big love fest pretty much for everybody.
Yeah, the Nature Boy is somebody that, as a wrestling fan, you love him. And then you get to see the real side of him, and then you're like, well, but you still have sympathy, or I guess it'd be empathy for him.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I mean, you know what? Yeah. Every person has their demons, no matter what.
Exactly.
And you know what? Sometimes we don't know what's going on behind that TV screen on the other side of the guy who's not being the character. It's kind of cool to see that. And see some of the things that he's had to endure during his career. And a lot of that, unfortunately, has been things that he's caused himself.
Right.
But he's still succeeded in spite of himself. That's kind of the wild part about it. But let's get right down to the actual documentary. And if you want to start off, some of the things that really stood out to you.
Well, I know I'm not the only one here, but I loved the animation in that documentary.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a 90-minute documentary, and Ric Flair is full of stories, and there's a lot of other stories that have been told that didn't make the air. But the use of the animation on some of those stories, I thought, was just fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
It captured everything. One of my favorites was the Vern Gagne training those guys, him and Steamboat, and going up the flights of stairs, and then having to carry someone up the flights of stairs, and then just over and over in the relentless punishment, and to be able to see it, even though it's animation, it's like, oh wow, that's crazy.
Well, and that impressed me a whole lot. As you're talking about the animation thing too, the whole thing with Flair liking to show everybody, being nude and flashing people all the time. I saw the director. He made mention that out of all the wrestlers he interviewed, some of them who didn't make the cut, every one of them had a Ric Flair being nude story.
Yeah, but no, the nudity thing with him being naked all the time, the animation with Sting on the airplane.
Yep.
That made me I was laughing out loud.
Well, and because some of those stories seem so far-fetched, I think the animation did a great job of saying, yes, it's crazy, but this is Ric Flair. So that, I mean, like sitting down talking to the sports psychologist and telling him how much he drank every day for 27 years. Those are stories that you sit there and go, holy cow.
Yeah.
But putting it in animation was a great way for people to visualize it instead of somebody telling that story.
Well, and I also like too, with Jim Ross, at the Holiday Inn, and just going to go in for a drink, and instead Rick buys what they say, like 150 kamikazes for 10 people.
Yes.
He's like, can't we just go in and buy a round and be done? And that, there is the Nature Boy and all of his glory right there, and just that 2 little minute animation.
Well, and I thought it was interesting too that they actually talked to 2 of his, ex-wives to kind of get a better feel, because we've always heard Ric Flair's side of the story of everything, but to hear their side of it and trying to be married to a guy like Ric Flair, and that was kind of interesting. And I also liked the part where he talked to his kids. Even though most of his kids we've seen on TV as they were growing up, and you know, and but to hear them candidly talk about how much of a bad father he was to them, which is kind of the crazy thing, because, the story went in there and it pretty much said too, part of the reason Reed had the problems he did with drugs and stuff was because of his father. So,
yeah. Well, it shines a light on the fact that wrestlers then worked all the time, and wrestlers now work well, especially WWE wrestlers. I mean, they have some crazy travel schedules.
Yeah.
Where, you got one day you're home and you're gone 6 days, and what is it? They say they work like 320 shows a year.
Yeah, something like that. It's unheard of what they do.
Something ridiculous. And you don't stop and think that, okay, well, while I'm watching him on Monday night, and then they roll into the town close to me for a SmackDown taping, or now it's live, the next night, and then Thursday night there's a house show. When are they home? And where is home? It's halfway across the country. It's, so people are getting, left in the cold while you're out, you're living your dream.
Oh, yeah.
But at some point, there's got to be a little bit of balance in there.
Oh, yeah. And that is the big difference between then and now, because as Rick talked on that documentary, every night he wasn't going to sit and be bored out of his gourd wherever he was. He was going to party, and that included a lot of drinking and just, getting together with different women and what have you. But as you were bringing up, comparing now to then, the funny thing is they talk about, and I've seen some different reports, I've seen interviews with wrestlers, they don't go to the bars that much anymore. Most of them are video game junkies, so they all get together and play video games when they're done. And that actually may be better for them.
That's true. And another reason, I've listened to several podcasts, albeit Stone Cold's podcast, Chris Jericho's podcast. A lot of it is before you could go out with the boys and nobody knew where you were or what you were doing.
Yeah. True.
And now it takes one person, and there's 50 photos all over social media. Instead of there being a bar fight that no one knows about, it'd be all over the place. So now they're better off staying out of sight.
Yeah. Getting back to the documentary a bit, of all the people that he interviewed, who kind of stood out to you as some of the stars of that documentary with kind of their take on Ric Flair?
Well, the one that jumps off at me is Triple H. That was the first one. I thought back when they were together in Evolution, he was the lead guy, Flair was the second guy, and then you had Batista and Orton as the young up-and-comers.
Yeah.
And when they were in that faction together, Rick was supposed to be the veteran guiding these guys. But after watching that, it makes you realize that Hunter was like the father of that group. Mm-hmm. And I think if he wouldn't have done what he did for Flair and still does for Flair, he probably wouldn't be around right now.
You might be right about that, yeah. Well, and I think part of that had to do with how badly he was treated by WCW towards the end of WCW. And I think the guy, he was already getting up in age. I don't know if you remember during that time, there were weird angles, putting him in a mental hospital and all kinds of they did a lot to tarnish the name of Ric Flair for WCW.
Yeah, they had some crazy, there's the Ric Flair that I remember as a young kid that was, the champ and styling and profiling, the horseman, that Ric Flair. And then there's the parody of Ric Flair, which was late WCW, where everything was, we're stripping down to our boxers and elbow dropping a book in the ring. And, there's two different Ric Flairs that I've grown up with.
Yeah.
And I prefer to enjoy the one that was the dominant champion and not the one from WCW. Going back to your earlier question, though, the other one I liked on there besides Triple H as my first pick, I really thought, Shawn Michaels had a lot to say too.
I agree with that. Yeah. I mean, I thought one of the best lines he had was as he talked about how Ric Flair didn't know Richard Flair. And I thought that was a very profound statement from him, saying that he didn't know how to like himself.
Yeah. Well, that's where the drinking comes in. You don't have to like yourself if you're drunk all the time.
Mm-hmm. Very true. There were a lot of other little tidbits sported in there. I mean, it was kind of interesting to see the Undertaker out of character, just kind of casually talking about Ric Flair. I thought that was really nice. Seeing Tully Blanchard and Arn Anderson there kind of chatting about him also. People that that were part of him during that era. So those were really good. The one person, though, too, that stuck out to me and I thought shined in that documentary was Hulk Hogan.
Yeah, that's true. I mentioned the other two and forgot to mention Hogan. And, I think that might be the first time Hogan put somebody over.
Well, the thing that I learned, though, too, and I've read different stories here and there, but they're really, really close, evidently, which, it's something you really don't think happens. But I guess their time in WCW together, they became really good friends. And I don't know if you remember, but when WCW went under, there was a little bit of a time there, but Hogan had like a tour with a bunch of his buddies that he took to Australia and all that, and they'd go wrestle to make a little money.
Right.
He brought Ric Flair with him to help Ric make money. And when he went to TNA, from what they say, that was part of the reason Flair came. He's like, hey, man, come here. You can get a payday, blah, blah, blah. But they are so close that when Flair was in the hospital, Hogan evidently flew right there to be by his bedside and be with him.
Yeah, see, I had no idea about any of that.
I didn't either.
I remember the WWF run, which should have led to WrestleMania, but didn't.
Yep.
And their time in WCW, I remember that well. I remember their fateful match on Baywatch.
Oh, yes. And I mean...
Yeah, but...
they were past their prime by then.
Exactly. And so, but, there's one of those things where you just don't realize you don't get to see behind the curtain that often, I guess.
No. But like I said, that was one, it stood out to me. I mean, that's Hogan putting it as it was. What's funny is that during the time that Flair was doing what he was doing for, Crockett's Promotions, WCW at the time, he was never considered in the same group as Hogan, ever. You know what I mean? It was like, oh, that's that redneck group of wrestling down south. Right, and then there's Hogan, who is, say your prayers. And it seems like in the last 10 years or so, WWE has done a really good job of trying to fix the problem and show people how great Flair really was. And, to say, hey, you know what? He's right there, Mount Rushmore. If you don't know wrestling, if you don't know who Flair is, the network's right there to show you how great he was. And they treat him that way.
Being a kid in the territories and not having all the technology like we do now.
Oh, yeah, but part of it, too, is, most people didn't watch WCW when it was Saturday night. Like I said, it had that stigma that it was Southern wrestling,
Right.
And I think that hurt them because they didn't really compete with WWF at that time. And that's why Flair... Yeah, he came in and he had that little run with WWF for about 2 years, I think is what he was there. And it was okay, but I don't know if everybody really accepted him when he came in there.
Well, you'd heard the name, but unless you had the chance to actually see him in person and follow his matches, you didn't know. Because I remember being a kid and a teenager at the time and hearing, Ric Flair's coming to the WWF.
Mm-hmm.
And I never got to see Ric Flair in his prime at that point in time.
Yeah.
So I didn't, it's like, okay, here comes a guy claiming to be the world's champ. But I didn't know that much about him. I knew the name and I'd seen him a little bit when he'd come to St. Louis to wrestle at Wrestling at the Chase. But that was about all I knew. It wasn't until I moved away south when I was like a freshman in high school before I ever got to see Sting on television. Because he wasn't on.
Yeah.
And that's when my first exposure to seeing Sting and Flair wrestle was when I moved south and actually was able to get that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, it's like, oh, wow, you heard about it, but I finally got to actually experience it. And then it's like, oh, wow, this is pretty neat.
Yep.
Where's this been my whole life?
Yeah, no doubt. That's the thing. The other thing I thought that they did good in the documentary, and this, I think it helped more of the casual fan, the way they told a little bit of the history of Flair, and then they kind of bring in something bad. It was kind of a roller coaster ride, it felt, in a way, up until about the end, when they got to the point where they were talking about, Reed's death and everything, and how much of an effect that had on it. But it was kind of interesting because if you walked into that with no idea being a wrestling of anything, you maybe knew the name, but you don't follow wrestling. I think it did a nice job of presenting who he is, and that there's some problems with the guy. But no matter what, every night he came out and gave you the Ric Flair show when he was wrestling, and I thought that was a nice part of there.
I agree. And the nice thing about it was it wasn't a wrestling documentary.
No, it
was
wasn't.
a look at the man behind Ric Flair and all of his demons and all of his, everything that's happened to the man. And I agree with you because there's people around here that know me as the crazy wrestling fan who wears a Ric Flair shirt to his son's baseball game that just says Space Mountain across the front of it.
No idea what that means.
and have, they're like, I had kids on the baseball team, like, why is there a guy on your shirt that says Space Mountain? I'm like, ask your dad, he'll explain it to you.
Yep.
But if you're exactly right. If you just sat down and watched, it was fantastic storytelling.
Yep.
It pretty well hooked you in and had you all the way to the very end.
Mm-hmm.
I also read too that people that viewed it last night was like 1.8 million.
1.8 million. Yep. That I think ESPN, one of their reporters, tweeted that out earlier today.
I read that somewhere, and that was like the number one for the 18 to 49 demographic, which is advertisers love that demographic.
Oh yeah.
So that's saying something too. If there's that many choices for entertainment, and you had that many people tune in just to watch.
I wonder, WWE and ESPN have had kind of a little relationship for a while. ESPN did the whole Scott Hall documentary. That's been about 6-7 years ago, I think. And WWE really wasn't part of that. There really wasn't a documentary. I think it was part of like their news show. And then remember they did something on NXT with Corey Graves and a few of the other guys as they were trying to make it to the big leagues.
Yeah, that was their it's not 60 Minutes. It's their...
Yeah, it's more their news thing. It wasn't an actual doc, but those are stories too that were very interesting, and I don't know how the appeal was for them, but this was kind of the first time they said, okay, let's just do a movie, documentary straight up on this. And I wonder if this will open the door for them to take a look and go, okay, maybe we do a story on Vince McMahon, or maybe we take a look at Hulk Hogan or something like that. You know what I mean? Because it's got to have someone with mass appeal. You're not going to do little stories here and there on whatever, but it's got to be someone with mass appeal that at one time a casual or maybe someone who's sort of checked on wrestling will know the name and actually want to check and see why that person is, why they're doing a story on them.
Oh, yeah. I mean, how could you not want to do a Vince McMahon 30 for 30?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, think about that man's career and what he's done in 35, 40 years.
Yeah.
And
I was surprised he wasn't part of this.
It makes you wonder, because I heard an interview with the director, and he said he had all kinds of footage, and there was over 20 people that got cut.
Yeah.
That didn't even make the,
I know Mick Foley
the
was
ones who
one,
did made it. Yeah, well, yeah, Mick Foley was one. And the ones who did made it, you only got a minute and a half of each one of them talking.
Yeah.
And, they sat down for an hour or half an hour and talked.
Now, I will say this. One of my complaints, though, is how ESPN had to sprinkle in some of their personalities into the show. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't really need that because, you know what? They're fans like us. That's great. But I would have much rather heard from his peers during that whole thing.
Yeah, I didn't need the college football reporter and Michelle Beadle. I could know without, Yeah, it added to the story. And yes, what they said was accurate. But it could have came from somebody else.
Yeah, that was my only complaint of everything that happened there. That's really my only, and it's not really a complaint. It's just something I kind of like, I don't know if I really needed it, but it meshed, it worked. But I would say of everything, that's probably the only thing I would even raise my hand and say, well, there's a little bit of weirdness there. That's it.
Well, I also did like that they added in, and you could tell it was during post-production when Flair got sick, they added in the part about his health and being put in the medical coma and that part, because that was one of the things when the director was doing a podcast, I actually tweeted out a question about, is his medical health going to be updated at the end of the show? But they actually worked it in between during the commercial breaks or the limited commercial breaks. So that was kind of nice that they did at least address it. I would love for that to come on DVD and have all the footage put on there, the stuff they didn't use.
They may. You never know. I mean, there's got to be something they're going to do with the rest of that footage because wrestling fans would love to see that. But, also, I wonder why WWE hasn't looked at something like that to put on the network themselves. they have so many people they could do stories on. And I wonder if there'd be an appeal for that at all, where you could just pick once a month, you just do a documentary on, or where are they now, and kind of follow the person and how they got to where they are.
They have a couple things on the network. Their little spotlight deal, but that stuff's like once a month. And it's just kind of a rehash of what you've already seen, and not really.
But I'm talking about straight up documentaries like this Flair thing. Not really matches, just how this guy came to be from start up to finish. And I just kind of wonder if that's would be something that they could do to pull people in.
Well, and I will say with this Flair documentary, I first heard about this being produced like a year ago.
Yeah.
Like it, been in talks and everything. And I have been waiting for this thing for about a year. Every time I'd look, when's this thing coming out? Couldn't find anything. And then eventually it started getting a little closer and a little closer. And when I sat down yesterday to watch it, I thought for sure, like, okay, at some point in time, I'm going to get discouraged. Like, I waited all this time for this.
Mm-hmm.
That never crossed my mind one time in 90 minutes.
Yeah.
The whole
sucked
thing.
you in.
It's like, man, they could have went 2 hours.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, you know what? We know most of the story, but it still sucked you in. And they did a nice job of telling the story of Ric Flair, and kind of more so about the guy we don't see, And it's kind of funny is that Ric Flair, the guy we don't see on TV, plays the same character because he doesn't like himself, evidently. That seems to be the big problem. So he plays that character 24/7, and that's why he got himself into the problems that he has. I give him credit. Very good documentary. It'll be interesting to see if we get anything more from ESPN, especially if they can see a big return on the ratings and stuff. That's what I'm waiting to see, is if they decide to do something else wrestling related. Now, if they had this many votes.
I know. I had heard the rumors that they were hot and heavy about wanting an Andre the Giant 30 for 30, but
HBO's got that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they have that. I was going to say.
HBO's doing a whole documentary because Bill Simmons, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, Bill Simmons is doing that with HBO, and they're putting that together.
That's right. Yeah, he's the one that helped start 30 for 30 to begin with.
That's right. And,
yeah, the Andre thing, I would watch it, but I find Flair way more interesting.
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
Flair is Flair's a bigger than life character. That's the thing. Andre was at the end of his career, probably, as we were coming into wrestling, and at that point Hogan was bigger than life, and Andre was just kind of winding things down. And I think that had a lot to do with it too. If you'd had a younger Andre, things may have been totally different. But yeah, it's been documentary central. So we've got that. We also had the release of the $1 Million Man's kind of documentary. I really haven't heard anybody talk about that yet. Have you?
I've heard a few people. A neighbor actually went with a group of guys and watched it, and they liked it.
Uh-huh.
So I've heard a few things, but I haven't heard much. But I did read that will be out on iTunes and somewhere else.
Yeah, not a surprise.
Fairly soon. So
cool. All right, then. Real quick, get out there, too. We've actually started posting a few more photos on Instagram. So all it is kind of different house shows we've been through. We'll post weird memorabilia that we have, things like that, different things. We're going to try and play around with Instagram, have a little fun with it. I mean, we've got a few photos up right now from some house shows you've been at in the last few years.
They're more recent. I got to do a little digging. I've got some from... Well, I mentioned I've got some from like 98.
Yeah.
So I just have to locate those items.
Yeah, same here. I've got stuff, but I was not a very good photographer back in the day.
Well, no, because back in the day it was those little Kodak disposables.
Yeah, stuff like that. But I'll have to scan a few. I know I've got stuff from, it had to be 98, 99, from a Raw in Milwaukee. And I know I've got a few, some of them are bad, but you can see Kane's pyro and things like that. So I guess get around to that. I'll post some stuff like that. And I've got all kinds of weird wrestling things around here. I'll take snapshots, but I just thought maybe that'd be an interesting thing to kind of play with. So if you've got things out there that you've taken photos of you think is cool, tweet it to us, man. Hey, that's cool. We're just all about putting things out there and saying, hey, we love wrestling. And this kind of shows why we like wrestling.
Your photo of your Kim Jong-il that looks like The Rock.
That's priceless right there, man. That thing is It's ugly.
A little bit creepy and cool at the same time.
Yep. But you can find us on Instagram at UTRR Podcast. That's going to do it for this week's show. Tom, thanks a lot for taking the time to chat with us again. We'll be back next week here on the Under the Ring Report.
Hello, wrestling fans. This is the Honky Tonk Man, the greatest WWF Intercontinental Champion of all time, and you're listening to Under the Ring Report.
Follow the Under the Ring Report on Twitter at UTRR Podcast. You can subscribe to the Under the Ring Report on iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher, or visit undertheringreport.com. Thanks for listening to the Under the Ring Report.